What does climate change, nuclear radiation, and COVID-19 have in common? They are all considered to be hyperobjects, a concept developed by Timothy Morton, professor at Rice College in Texas, United States. First coined in his book The Ecological Thought in 2010, and then developed in his book Hyperobjects, Philosophy and Ecology After the End of the World in 2013, hyperobjects are things that are massively distributed in time and space relative to humans. In this presentation, I will explore in more detail what hyperobjects are, the 5 characteristics Morton describes them to have, and then conclude with some considerations and questions arising from Morton's theory. Morton's concept of the hyperobject is based on object-oriented ontology, or OOO for short. OOO attempts at shifting away from phenomenological subjectivism to an objective mode of understanding objects. It critiques and attempts to avoid anthropocentrism and correlationism, the position that objects correlate to the conditions of representation given by a human subject. OOO maintains that the reality of anything outside this correlation is unknowable. OOO is sometimes referred to as a flat ontology, in that it levels all objects with the same metaphysical status, including humans. As Morton says, they are as important, ontologically speaking, as a styrofoam cup. Hyperobjects are real physical objects. They are not collections or systems of individual objects, nor are they mental constructs. They are real entities whose primordial reality is withdrawn from humans. They differ from other everyday objects in that they are hyper in relation to such objects. They include those manufactured by humans, and indeed many of the hyperobjects Morton focuses on are either directly or indirectly created by humans. Other examples include oil, all the styrofoam ever created, the Florida Everglades, and evolution. Already here, we may start to have questions from these examples that Morton uses. For example, isn't styrofoam individual objects made from the same material? Is evolution physical? Exploring the 5 characteristics that Morton argues hyperobjects exhibit may help answer these initial questions. Hyperobjects exhibit 5 characteristics: viscosity, non-locality, temporal undulation, phasing, and interobjectivity. I will now explore each of these. Viscosity refers to how we are caught up with hyperobjects. They stick to other objects, including humans. The more we learn about hyperobjects, the more we realize that we are deeply enmeshed with them. Morton refers to a scene in the 1999 film The Matrix, in which the character Neo, in process of transcending from the simulation world to the real world, touches a mirror that becomes liquid and sticky. Morton writes that it's not the reality that the subject that dissolves, the very capacity to mirror things, to be separate from the world. Hyperobjects are impossible to shake off. Viscosity also reveals how the more we learn about hyperobjects, the more we realize that they can't be rid of. There is no way for them to go. The more we fight to remove ourselves from the hyperobject, the more aware we become of how glued we are to them. These are images from the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster in 2010, which occurred in the Gulf of Mexico and is considered to be the largest marine oil spill in the history of the petroleum industry. The hyperobject oil particularly demonstrates viscosity. Morton writes, the more you try to get rid of it, the more you realize you can't get rid of it. Hyperobjects seriously undermine the notion of away. While public and media attention has moved on to other spectacles, the oil continues to act. Indeed, the more scientific information we gather in the years following the disaster, the more we realize not only the impact and scale of the oil now seeping throughout the Atlantic, as indicated in these images showing the likely spread 5 years after the event, but it also demonstrates how viscous the object is, in both the literal and the ontological sense. While photos can capture local manifestations of oil, scientific data can highlight the geographical scale, which brings me on to the second characteristics of hyperobjects, non-locality. To explain the non-locality of hyperobjects, Morton refers to magic eye pictures to describe how the hyperobject is always and already there, existing before and after we experience its local manifestation. Morton writes how the individual squiggles are actually distributed pieces of a higher dimensional object that seems to emerge. In a magic eye picture, the hidden image, in this case of penguins, is already there, before we look at it. As global warming, for example, is distributed massively across the biosphere, it's very hard to see as a unique whole entity. Like the image in a magic picture, global warming is real, but it involves a massive, counterintuitive perspective shift to see it. Since hyperobjects are vastly distributed across space and time, they can never be fully understood in their entirety. We only experience local manifestations, such as the rain and wind with global warming, or radiation sickness from a nuclear blast. Morton writes about the eyewitness accounts of the Hiroshima bomb. Each witness may give their unique account of the event, but no single witness experiences the whole bomb. Each testimony is a local manifestation due to the constraints of human physicality. Non-locality is, in part, the reason things like styrofoam and evolution are considered hyperobjects for Morton. From our limited perspective, styrofoam may appear as an individual localized object scattered across the globe, but from another perspective, one that considers the deep and massive stretch of time and space, the totality of styrofoam could be considered one hyperobject. Hyperobjects are massively distributed in time, so much so that they become uncanny as we cannot see to the end of them. They make us realize that we're already lost inside them. Morton references this cartoon of two rocks conversing to convey the temporal span of hyperobjects and the intersection with human temporality. Such timescales are baffling, terrifying, difficult to hold in the mind, yet they're not infinite. They offer instead very large finitude. Morton argues how, in a way, it is easier to imagine eternity than something with a very large finitude. They write, "Forever makes you feel important. 100,000 years makes you wonder whether you can imagine 100,000 anything." To demonstrate temporal undulation, Morton references the sound art of Felix Hess. In Air Pressure Fluctuations, Hess has recorded the sounds from the window of his apartment in New York for 5 days, and then sped the recording up 360 times. Here is a short clip of the 30-minute piece, which for Morton exemplifies how hyperobjects exist on a different timescale to what we can normally access. Hyperobjects phase in and out of human perception, as they occupy a high-dimensional phase space that makes them impossible to see as a whole on a regular three-dimensional human scale. Morton describes a phase space as the set of all the possible states of a system. This can be visualized in a Lorentz attractor shown here of the sum of weather events in a phase space. Hyperobjects phase in and out of our experience. We only see pieces of them at a time precisely because they exhibit this transdimensional quality. This is the reason they appear non-local and temporally foreshortened. This is why we can't see climate change, or evolution, or the totality of styrofoam. Morton argues that by occupying a high enough dimensional space, hyperobjects would appear as static objects. And this again partly explains why Morton considers things like evolution as a hyperobject. Morton concedes that we can never occupy such a high dimensional space. A hyperobject passes through 1,000 sieves, namely the equipment we use to detect them, such as our eyes and ears, computer software, which emerge as translated information at the other side of this mesh. While science can help us plot, graph, and visualize hyperobjects, we fail to see its entirety. We only see slices rendered in a useful way. Like the phasing of the moon, there always exists necessary gaps in our experience of hyperobjects, but they still exist. As Morton puts it, global warming doesn't go golfing at the weekend. The gaps and ruptures are simply the invisible presence of the hyperobject itself, which looms around us constantly. Interobjectivity, the fifth characteristic of hyperobjects, refers to the interconnectedness not just of hyperobjects, but apparently all entities whatsoever. Morton calls this system the mesh, a metaphor for the strange interconnectedness of things, one that emphasizes the gaps and absences in our knowledge and experience of objects. Hyperobjects are interobjective in that they are part of causal webs and leave footprints on other objects. Morton refers to the interobjective system consisting at least of a dinosaur, mud, a human photographer, and electromagnetic waves. Morton writes, the dinosaur's reality exists inter-objectively. There is some sensuous connection between the dinosaur, the rock, and the human, despite their vastly differing timescales. The footprint is a trace of the hyperobject evolution that joins me, the dinosaur, and the mud together. If every object is part of this interconnected mesh, then what differentiates hyperobjects? Morton claims that the interobjectivity of a hyperobject reveals how it is never experienced directly, but only as mediated through other entities in a shared sensual space in this interconnected mesh. For example, Morton describes that the hyperobject of a gigantic ancient bamboo forest on Kilai Mountain in central Taiwan is experienced through a theatre of air, leaves, and stalks, and are mediated once more through watching a QuickTime movie of the forest. So what is the point of thinking about hyperobjects? Is such a theory useful, and if so, in what ways? Morton describes that the realization of hyperobjects produces a quake in being. They force us to reflect on our place on Earth and in the cosmos, and affects core ideas of what it means to exist. They have forever shifted humans' cognitive boundaries. We realize we are not observing the problems, we are in them. Morton claims that hyperobjects force us to accept the end of the world, not in a fire and brimstone apocalypse, but as the death of the idea that humans are at the privileged center of the universe. We are actually enmeshed with objects on every imaginable scale. Hyperobjects humiliate us. They are ever elusive, uncanny, and contradictory beasts that force us to accept a degree of powerlessness. We are revealed as weak and lame in our inability to address them. This explains why climate change is sometimes termed the perfect moral storm. We can never truly understand the scale and interconnectedness of it, and never will. This explains why it is easy for deniers and skeptics, because there is never direct proof of causal links. This may also partly explain the worldwide government apathy to take action. How do we take on such a beast? Morton advocates coexistence with hyperobjects, insisting we must care for them, given their enormity and how long they will persist for. Morton argues that by embracing the hyperobjects that loom in our social space, we have a chance to create more democratic modes of coexistence between humans and non-humans. But what does practical action look like? How exactly do we embrace and care for the hyperobject? What are the ethical implications? If hyperobjects reveal us to be weak, lame, and vulnerable, then perhaps they are a dangerous way to think of things like climate change, as it follows that hope is useless and action is futile. It can be argued that Morton's theory leads to pessimism or even nihilism. Should humans just give up and succumb to hyperobjects if we can never fully understand them, let alone address them? Morton's theory itself can be criticized. Is it even true? Are the 5 characteristics necessary and sufficient? That is, do objects have to obtain all 5 of them to be considered a hyperobject? If there is an inherent unknowability to them, then how do we even check? And this is without even touching on the criticisms of object-oriented ontology. Suffice to say, if one doesn't accept O, then the foundations of Morton's theory becomes very shaky. Other critics have pointed out the contradictions in Morton's theory. For one, Morton claims hyperobjects avoids anthropocentrism, but at the same time, hyperobjects are manifestations of the Anthropocene, which therefore gives significant power and status to humanity for creating such objects. Despite its problems, the concept of the hyperobject has inspired work across disciplines within and outside philosophy and ecology, including art, literature, architecture, and archaeology. Other than climate change, scholars have embraced a framework of the hyperobject to ask questions regarding ethnicity, gender, war, capitalism, class, and climate migration. Whether such things are indeed hyperobjects, or how useful it is to think of such entities in a framework of hyperobjectivity, is perhaps the reason why Morton's theory warrants further engagement. Perhaps not on the dramatic scale Morton describes, but such engagement does demonstrate some level of a quake in being, or at least a quake in thinking for some scholars. Maybe a quake in being or quake in thinking has occurred on some level for you today from this presentation.